As Saul said, EY, he calls it Ernst & Young, I call it EY, it's a new, modern, younger brand, is very passionate about this subject, especially about cohorts like Latinos. And it goes this way. As you can imagine, we are an entity of 260,000 people around the world. 50 of them are here in the U.S. In the U.S. alone, we hire 15,000 people a year. There's 60,000 people over the world a year to come join us. So we are, essentially, for lack of a better term, a machine, a talent machine. Train, recruits, and trains. So the labor market, the labor force, and the talent, the quality of talent is extremely important to EY. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, in a way, we advise the largest corporations in the world, private, public, non-for-profit, all over the world. And many of the things we do for them involve growth in the capital markets. So the growth of the global economy, and in this case, the growth of the U.S. economy, is central to who we are at EY. So when we gather around to talk about issues of growth, you talk about where growth might come from or where talent might be and how to nurture that talent, there's inescapable conclusion that we're going to land talking about cohorts like the Latino cohort. Now, to tie it back to the Peterson Institute, as Saul said, we have had a long-standing relationship with the Peterson Institute because of their position of credibility and objectivity and the caliber of their work product and obviously their fellows. And so we've done a series of activities with them over the past, and one of the studies I want to highlight is a study we did. We asked them the question, and if you know the EY tagline is to ask the better question. We asked them the question of what would happen if you have greater representation of women at the management of corporations. And they came back, and just to give you the summary, tagline on this was that if you had 30% representation of women in upper management, you will have a 6-point premium on the bottom line of your company. So now that is a fact worth talking about. So then here we are, and we're asking another question, and that is, what is the impact of Latinos? Is there an impact? Let's presume. We know there must be something happening, but what is the impact of Latinos in the U.S. economy? What's the tie to the growth of the U.S. economy? And off they went and did this, as I said, groundbreaking study. I hope all of you have gotten it. We have a summary as well for you. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I'll start by asking Jacob just to give us a synopsis of what the main themes were in the findings in your study.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ted. And let me start by thanking you and the LDC for inviting me to come here. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it was a great pleasure to work with both EY and Saul on this study because it actually came about, as you said, Ted, from a question and a very sort of basic run-of-the-mill economics model. Where does growth come from? And as we were then fortunately guided by both Saul and EY to take perhaps a slightly more holistic approach to that. So the study basically has three main components. It has a component about labor force productivity. It has a component about entrepreneurship. And it has a component about, excuse me, educational attainment of the Latino cohort. And I must say I was really very pleasant, not surprised, but still it was great for me to sit through Jeffrey's presentation in the morning because it's basically a study that uses many of the same data as we did and reaches largely the same conclusions. And just in a broader context, I think it's important to Charles' earlier point about data. When you have different people looking at the same data at the same time and reaching the same conclusions, that's how you get to facts. That's how you get to truth. if you like. And that's obviously something that is in short supply, certainly in Washington these days. So I think that's an important element. But to start with the first component, and this will overlap with some of what Jeffrey already talked about, is that when you look at the U.S. growth going forward, most projections will say that the U.S. economy has a potential growth rate of 2% a year. 2% a year. That's historically relatively low, but it really does make a difference when the economy's starting point is 20 trillion. Right? Because 2% of 20 trillion is $400 billion in additional economic capacity, activity every year. So our question was basically, where does that come from? Now, traditional economic models will tell you that there is essentially two components, and this was mentioned by Jeffrey earlier as well, of future growth. There is the size of the labor force, which is kind of a quantitative component to it, and then there is labor productivity, which is basically the qualitative element to it. How smart are people in what they do? So what we do is focusing initially on the quantitative element, the labor force growth. We use basically the same data as Jeffrey does. And we reach largely the same conclusions. We have a slightly longer path. We end our data in 2048, so the numbers are a little bigger. But the big picture is the same. And that is that about 80 to 85% of future net job creation in the United States comes from the Latino cohort. In raw numbers, that means that as the total projected employment, the number of jobs in the US in the next 30-odd years will grow by about 18 million. 15 million of those new net jobs will be from the Latino cohort. That is a very large number. And it is, in fact, I think, worth recalling that while the Latino community is obviously not the first community to come to the United States as immigrants, even though that's not the main contributor anymore. There has been prior waves, the Irish, the Germans, etc. But I would argue that certainly it is the case that over such a prolonged period of time, because the Latino community's, if you like, demographic dividend, and that is a sort of economic term that basically means that you have either a national population or a community who has a larger percentage of its worker or its people in the working age population, or basically productively employed. That comes at a time when the rest of the US population slows down. Population growth slows down, the non-Latino component. So there is no other ethnic community in the United States that has ever come to the United States and accounted for 80% or so of net new job creation for several decades. This is unprecedented, and this is a function of the fact that when earlier migration waves came, in the late 19th century, etc., they came when the native population was also growing very rapidly. That is not the case anymore. So this is really a one-off in American history. That is the first component. The second component is educational attainment. And has been mentioned by several speakers already today and even yesterday, last night. It is a fact that historically, educational attainment by the Latino community lagged the US average. That's a fact. But what is also a fact, and we document this in our report, that, as was also just mentioned by Sol, the basic components of improved educational attainment are now in place for the Latino community. High school graduation rates for the Latino community has risen by 50%, from a graduation rate roughly of 60 to one at about 90 today, which is roughly the US average. If you look at the share of certificates, associate degrees, the Latino cohort now accounts for a disproportionately large share of those degrees granted in the United States. So a lot of catch-up or convergence, as we like to say in economics, is happening. It is not the case yet that Latinos graduate at the same ratio at colleges and at college level and higher, so there is still a lot of work to be done. But it is the basics are certainly there, and I would really recommend the article that Armando, the front page of the New York Times today, which basically makes the link between increased educational attainment and lower fertility, which is a relationship that is very, very strong across economic history. We have seen it in many, many countries, and we're now seeing it play out also among the Hispanic community here, which basically is that as the parents get better, or as women get better educated, they tend to have fewer children. This is exactly what is happening in the United States. Then the third component of the study is essentially about entrepreneurship. And Jeffrey spent a lot of time on it. We find essentially the same results, which is because we use the same data from the Kaufman Foundation, namely that Latinos are disproportionately likely to start their own businesses. And again, I think it's important to put this in context, because the overall dynamism of the U.S. economy has been declining over the last 30, 40 years. And by dynamism, I mean if you look at the share of businesses that are started every year, you will see that that percentage has gone down since the late 1970s. And this is, I mean, it's not really clear why that is, but certainly overall aging of the population has a lot to do with that. So again, from the perspective of the contribution of the Latino community, that you have a community that is disproportionately entrepreneurial coming in to the workforce right at the time when the rest of the population, so to speak, gets less entrepreneurial, is exactly the tonic that the US economy needs going forward. And again, I would say that if you put it in a historical context, again, the entrepreneurial, it is certainly the case, as Jeffrey mentioned, that historically, foreign-born population, migrants are more entrepreneurial than the native-born. This is also the case in the Latino community, but it is not the case as it was that when foreign-born, earlier waves of migrants came to the United States, they were facing a native population that were younger and likely more entrepreneurial. But again, this is not the case today for Latinos. So the relative contribution of the Latino community at this point in time and in the next couple of decades is going to be disproportionately large. And I think I'll stop there.
Excellent, excellent synopsis, Jacob. Thank you very much. And that's certainly a lot to digest. So then, Steve, you have spent a lifetime chronicling businesses, looking at macroeconomic data, microeconomic data, shifts and trends, talking to CEOs, talking to policymakers. You have a really broad view of our economy and our history. How does it sound when you hear these observations, these findings, and particularly in the three areas of labor and productivity, education attainment, and entrepreneurship?
Well, to be politically incorrect, the Latino community for the American economy is like the cavalry coming to the rescue in terms of growth. And I think every immigrant group that comes to this country initially gets stereotyped. A lot of myths get encrusted about it. Whether it's the 1840s when we had massive immigration from Ireland and from Germany, there was a very fierce nativist movement in this country that wanted to send them back, very, very strong politically. Very strong reaction in this state and others to Asian immigration in the 1880s, 1890s. Huge reaction to immigration from Central and Eastern Europe in the 1890s and early 1900s that led to anti-immigration legislation after World War I. There was always concern with these waves of immigration, could they integrate into American society? So no surprise the Latino community, which is a very diverse community, would start with the same kind of stereotypes. But the nice thing about this report and other data out there, and which excites me as a journalist, is that the Latino community is about to blast, just as previous communities have done, these stereotypes. The Irish could only clean houses. A century later, they had the largest per capita income in the United States. Same thing with the Italian community. We all get hit with these, my grandmother's Irish, they all get hit with these stereotypes. And then in this country, have the opportunity, by golly, they surge ahead, and then a new group comes along and goes through the same thing. Not exactly, but as Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes. And one of the things that really, which I'm glad this report did, is the extraordinary entrepreneurship in the Latino community. Now, Latino household incomes were hurt in the last decade, but in an environment of deregulation, which we've had for a little over 2 years, an environment of tax cutting, by golly, that changes. As you know, in 2017, Latino median household income went up 3.7% versus 2.6% for the rest of the U.S. population. In terms of entrepreneurship, there are 3.3 million Hispanic-controlled businesses in 2012. In 2017, that already surged to 4.6 million. And that number is only going to get greater. A Bank of America survey found that Latino-owned businesses were more likely to be in a mood to hiring people than non-Latino businesses. And the importance of deregulation can't be emphasized enough. One of the most devastating things for everybody, but for entrepreneurs, was the overreaction to the 2008 economic crisis, especially codified in Dodd-Frank. Long story short, what happened was that the cost of making a loan to a small business, that is loans under $1 million, the fixed costs went up astronomically. And so the amount of lending to small businesses, startups, plummeted in the United States, while lending to large companies, who didn't really need it as much, went up almost 80%. Total against what you need for real growth. Just give you an example. Banks were told to cut back on small lending. One example, many of you have seen Fixer Upper, the show with Joanna and Chip Gaines. 10 years ago, they were doing a development in Waco, Texas. Halfway through, they got a call from the bank saying they're cutting their line of credit in half. This is before they went on TV and became famous. And they faced bankruptcy. They're halfway through, doing things right, as you know they do things right, and they're about to be ruined. Even though their credit was good, they're doing things on time, doing things well, they're about to be ruined. Long story short, they scrounged and found ways from others, non-traditional sources, to keep this thing going. But now that is being eased, so you're starting to see lending ease up a little bit. Just one other example, in Philadelphia, a couple of people, graduates of Wharton, so they knew about business cash flows and all that, had a successful restaurant, wanted to start a second one, went to the bank, and the bank would only give them 20% of the loan they needed to start the second restaurant, even though their first one was cash flow positive from day one. That's the kind of environment we're in. So this whole thing on quantitative easing and overregulation was like the old Soviet Union, where the saying was, zero interest rates sound very nice, but in the old Soviet Union they said the health care is free, but you can't get any. And that was especially true for small businesses. But in terms of what's happening now, in the last couple of years, the Latino community is absolutely extraordinary. As you know, the employment rates have plummeted more than half of what they were 2 or 3 years ago. That is almost unprecedented. The poverty rate went from 19.4% to 18.3%. Biggest drop since they've been accumulating these statistics in the early 1970s. And on the education front, even though it's right what Jacob says and what others say that Latinos aren't there yet in terms of higher education, my own view is, given what's happening in the whole education field with high tech, that is going to become less of an impediment than ever before. What employers are now looking for is not the degree that you bring, but do you bring the skills? In other words, those certificates count much more than before. I was talking to a big software company the other day. He said, I don't care if they didn't graduate from kindergarten. If they bring the right skills, I will hire them. So I think the normal barriers that you would get from higher education are going to be dropping, especially as higher education goes through a revolution. We have a real scandal in higher ed. You can tell I'm not running for anything to diss higher ed. But 50% of kids who go to college don't graduate within 6 years. And now we have kids coming out with student debt of $1.6 trillion. There's no earthly reason why those education costs keep going up and up and up. And you mentioned Purdue. The head of Purdue, Mitch Daniels, came in 7 years ago, put a freeze on tuition increases, even though since then he's hired more professors, doing more outreach and the things that a university should do, and doing things like with making a deal with Amazon to lower costs of textbooks for kids. Next year, a kid attending Purdue will spend less dollars, these are nominal dollars, not inflation dollars, will spend less dollars going to Purdue than a kid did in 2012. That is the kind of a reform you're going to see. So the seeming barrier of higher education to the Latino community, I think, is going to become less relevant as people look for skills. And this gets to another myth about the Latino community, low skills. No surprise if you come to a country young without skills, your income starts very low. Duh. But after time, as you get skills, especially as a lot of them start to say, hey, I understand this field, I can start a business, even if you don't have a degree from Harvard, guess what? Their incomes go up as time goes on. And so as immigration levels actually level out, as you pointed out in your report from Mexico, Central America may be different. From Mexico, it's gone down. No surprise, average incomes are going to be going up even more. That's a normal course of events. So the really exciting thing is about with tax cuts, especially for small businesses, this 20% credit. If you're a small pass-through, 20% of your income can be exempted from a federal income tax on that pass-through. So if you make $100,000, you're in the 24% bracket, you'll right off the bat save almost $5,000. That is crucial. And you never know it from the debate today. In conclusion, we're going to have an immigration debate in the next few years. And the question is going to be, how do we increase legal levels of immigration because we're suffering from labor shortages? So the age, as you know, in closing, the median age of the Latino community, the last I saw in this country is 28.7 years. The rest of the population, 38. In demographic world, that 10 years is huge. And that's the dynamic. Young people, I'm dynamic, but most of us in this age group are not. But young people are inherently more dynamic. And so the old myths, stereotypes of the Latino community are going to go away with the stereotypes of all the others. And you're going to be a leader, driver. And that's what I like about this report. And our reporting is we're going to get that message out there. Because we were talking before, just one little thing. Why aren't there more Latinos in TV ads? I mean, you know, think of it. Think of it. And even today, just in closing, even today, in terms of the Latino community, your GDP, the Latino GDP in this country exceeds, it's the 7th largest in the world. Exceeds Canada, exceeds Brazil, exceeds India, exceeds Italy, at least reported in Italy. So already today, even as the rocket ship is just getting off the launching pad, this is a huge community. And I'm, as a journalist, love to be able to break the story. You people out there, not you in this room, but others who think they know something about the U.S., are missing this humongous story. One reason why it's exciting is that in a free market, which Saul and others so fiercely advocate, is a person's success is other people's success. Your success is my success and the country's success. So we all benefit from it.
Not to put words in your mouth, but I would say that you think things are looking up.
Yes, big time. And again, I think we're going to recognize again that the real source of wealth in a society is not physical things. It's the human mind, the desire to get ahead. And one of the polls that I found encouraging was that Latino households have a much higher, again, going against stereotype, much higher work ethic, believer in hard work, than the rest of the population. So that's
Steve, you talked about this, getting the story out, and one of the things that happened after the Peterson Institute's report was published was that Forbes online picked it up and did a story, a tremendous story, and in fact, with an eye-catching title that I would read just for those who are not familiar with it: "Hispanics, not Trump, are the biggest engine of the U.S. economic growth." But the story was really about the impact that, recognizing the different observations that Jacob walked us through. It is exactly what I think many people ought to be reading. And I commend your organization for getting the story out there so visibly and so quickly after the study, in a moment that is very important for people to have this information.
Well, the title was eye-catching, but even though I have differences with our president on tariffs, and just as an aside, tariff is another word for sales tax. And putting sales taxes on us, yes, China may be hurt more, but we're hurt. Mutual hurting each other, just leave the 50 Shades of Gray, keep it out of economics. I think there are better ways to deal with those things. And the other thing is immigration. But two things this administration has gotten right is lowering taxes and lowering regulation, especially on lending. And just as an aside, in terms of servicing this growing community, if banks are prevented by regulation, you're going to see in a different way what happened in California 120 years ago when a son of Italian immigrants, a fellow named A.P. Giannini, saw that this growing immigrant community was not being serviced, that middle class was not being serviced, banks only served the rich. He left the bank that he was on the board of, started his own bank servicing this community because he understood the opportunity there, provided loans that other banks wouldn't. He started consumer lending, $25, 3 or 4% interest rate, doing branch banking, which was never done in those days, advertising. He advertised in different languages, Russian and Italian and Portuguese and others, Spanish. And the bank grew and eventually morphed into Bank of America, became largest bank in the world. So the opportunities of servicing this community, if regular banks can't do it adequately, future AP Gianninis will be out there to do it and do well, and the community will do well.
So we talked about entrepreneurship. Steve, you mentioned it. Jacob, you mentioned it as well in your synopsis. But can we dive a little bit more deeply on the subject of entrepreneurship and how that was observed in the study?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, basically, the big picture conclusion is, as we've talked about repeatedly, that Latinos are disproportionately likely to become entrepreneurs. But one of the things the study also does is that it actually shows that you can say that conceptually there are two different types of entrepreneurs. There is the opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, which was basically what you saw also on the earlier panels here. You see people seeing an opportunity in the market that is unserved and going and doing it. And then there is the sort of necessity-driven entrepreneurship, where basically people are out of a job, the economy is bad, they have no other choice than to start their business. Now, obviously, for productivity increases, it's the former you want. And the good news, and one of the things we show in our report, is that this is exactly the kind of entrepreneurship that the Latino community excels in. It is opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is also very important for the other sort of component of long-term growth, which is productivity growth. Now, productivity growth is a tricky concept for economists to deal with because we don't actually really know where it comes from. But the two things you can say about it is that most studies will say that rising educational attainment contributes to productivity in the long run, and then there is entrepreneurship. So if you want to raise the last many years of actually very low productivity growth in the United States, you need more entrepreneurs. And again, this is very much where the Latino community will, in my opinion, play a or contribute a disproportionate amount to the benefit of everyone, as Steve just said.
And the government estimates of a 2% growth, I think, are nonsense. That if you have the right environment on regulation, taxation, and the Federal Reserve learns to behave itself. I've got a movie online on public television called In Money We Trust. You can see it on moneywetrust.org, which gets into that. But you have the right environment. There's no reason why we can't grow 3+%. We did throughout most of the history of this country. And it's precisely the energy of people who want to get ahead. And people say, you know, one of the raps on the Latino community is, oh, they start up businesses, but, you know, they're, you know, dealers and tire shops, and, you know, how does that matter? Look around you. What's one of the most successful companies out there? What's one of the most common commodities in the world? Coffee. Every country that can grow it grows it. Anyone can make it. Everyone sells it. Airlines still serve a version of it for free. Yet what's one of the most successful companies out there? Starbucks took this common commodity and made it a multi-billion-dollar business around the world. So you're going to find entrepreneurs seemingly going into established legacy areas. Somebody's going to figure out how you make it a high-margin business. That's the glory of entrepreneurship, seeing what others don't.
So we talked also about immigration, and Steve, you mentioned it from a historical perspective, and Jacob, you mentioned also the stats on immigration. It is happening already that the last tranche of baby boomers is retiring. We have declining birth rates, as you mentioned earlier, Jacob, and also we want to grow the country. We want to grow the economy. We don't want to become Western Europe. We don't want to become Japan. Yet the subject of immigration obviously is hotly debated and will be hotly debated in the next couple of years again. What can we say about the Latino immigration at the moment and its place in the growth of the economy from the studies perspective? And then Steve, I'd like your view as well.
I mean, I think the interesting thing is actually that when you look at the long-term history of population growth in the United States, you know, we tend to think of the United States as a country of immigrants, which is true, relative to most other countries in the world. But when you look at the sources of population growth, until recently, it was actually 2/3 to 75% growth that came from the growth of the native population because of high fertility rates in the native population. Now, as these have come down, obviously, now we're at a situation where one, overall population growth has come down, but the share of population growth that comes from immigration is now just about 50%. And if we look forward, so you can basically say from that point of view, the U.S., ironically, is a nation of immigrants more than it has arguably ever been, or at least for the last 50 years, as a share of the total population growth. And that, as the native population will continue to decline, and the latest fertility rate numbers are not very good. If I were to ask you, for instance, which country in the world, which country has the highest fertility rates of the latest available numbers, is it the United States or is it Russia? Which one do you think it will be? Now, it's a leading question, but it's Russia. That tells you both that Russia is higher than you think, but also that the United States is at the lowest fertility rates ever recorded at the moment, and falling. So what this tells you overall is that the U.S., if we wanted to sustain economic growth, needs to become an even more country of immigrants than it has been. Now there is an issue there, and Steve alluded to it, which is that we know from history that the closer you live to another country, the more likely you are to migrate. So the sort of migration rates from Mexico to the United States is far higher than from any other country of origin. But the reality is that fertility rates in Mexico are also 2%. They're way down relative to 30 years ago. So there isn't going to be the same inflow from Mexico. And in fact, one of the things we estimate in our study is that the overall raw numbers of Latino migration to the United States has probably peaked it's not going to get any as a share of the total, roughly 1.1 million new migrants, permanent migrants every year, has probably peaked. And as we sort of look around the world, if you want to sustain even that level, never mind grow it, you have to look further afield. And that, of course, raises the broader question of what do you do to attract migrants from literally geographically further afar. That's a big policy challenge.
But on the fertility rates, until the financial crisis of 2008, the U.S. was very different from the rest of the developed world. Our birth rates were just about replacement level, unlike Europe or Japan, or even countries like Korea. And I think once people have faith again that there is a future, which people haven't had in the last 10 years, I think that birth rate will go up. And I think one of the reasons you have low birth rates in these other countries is, and this gets to a whole different realm, there's a malaise about a lack of faith in the future, live for the present, and why make the sacrifice for the future. I think this country will break that. And in terms of attracting immigrants, once we get an immigration system where if you play by the rules, you don't have to wait 10 years and have your files lost and everything else, where it can be done in a very expeditious and efficient way, I think you're going to see people from parts of the world where they see less opportunity at home, especially entrepreneurs, are going to want to come here, which is why you have so many French people here and people from other countries. They don't see opportunity at home. And the benefit of that is it's going to eventually force these other countries, hopefully, to get their own acts together and get policies that enable young, ambitious people to have a chance to really flourish. But in this day of high mobility and high tech, why would you stay where you can't go ahead? People are going to be impatient. So I think if people realize the U.S. once again is what we were in the 80s and 90s, a boom area, I think the immigration filings will go up, I think. Because Europe, as you know, in Europe, since 2008, the average growth rate of the EU is 0.8% a year. We are grousing after 2008. We were only doing 1.5%. That would be boom times in those countries. 0.8. Some countries even worse. Crazy.
I guess I would sort of, for the sake of argument, be slightly more pessimistic on fertility rates, actually. Because if you look at the sort of detailed numbers, you will see that the one thing that is happening and is happening faster in the Latino community than other communities is that the average age of first childbirth for women is rising. And when that happens, you are not, historically, if you look at the experience of other countries, going to go back to what it was before. It is a permanent shift downwards.
So we could become, in a few hundred years, the first species to extinct itself.
But it does away with the also the stigma that the immigrants come and produce children that are going to be weight on the economy, when in fact none of that is true.
I think none of that is true. I mean, one of the themes of our report is also what we call the Great Convergence, which is that if you look at the two probably most important parameters for a community, a specific community in a population, which is the level of fertility that the community has relative to the rest of the population, because fertility has obviously an enormous impact on household formation, the level of female in the workforce and all that, and then the educational attainment of that community. Those are two parameters in which, until now, the Latino community has been different than the US average. That is a fact. And that has undoubtedly, as you say, Ted, nourished certain stereotypes about the Hispanic community. But none of that is true anymore. The fertility rates of the Hispanic community is now just about 2, which is not, it's higher than the US average, but it's not very much higher. And as I said, in terms of high school graduation and other education attainment parameters, we're now in the Latino community basically at the US average. So there's an enormous convergence. And this is basically along the lines of what Steve said earlier with the sort of reaction to earlier waves of migrants. Will they assimilate? Will they? Of course they did, and of course the same thing has happened.
So, Jacob, the data that you have put forth in the study is obviously compelling. And the reaction that you have expressed, Steve, is equally compelling because it's coming from your perspective in the business, understanding all the mechanics of the growth of our economy. Yet, we sit around and talk about why is it that some organizations don't get it? Why is it that this is not as widely known and understood? And you spend a lot of time, as I said earlier, with CEOs and boards of directors and policymakers. And I have to ask you, what advice would you have for us in trying to get that cohort educated? The people making these very, very macro decisions that will ultimately impact not only the population, but also the growth of the economy.
I think reports like the Peterson report, I was giving Jacob my condolences that in order to give credibility to their historic findings, he had to have about 8 pages of equations and methodology to show that, give it a patent of, but that's what you have to do to get these words out. But in especially this high-tech age, the word's going to get out very quickly, especially when you use statistics. If you just take Latino GDP, a huge community. You take startups, Latino entrepreneurs, huge and growing, going utterly against the stereotype. I think that word's going to spread fairly quickly. And that this whole thing of myths or stereotypes of 40, 50 years ago are being blasted away. In fact, what probably delayed the recognition was precisely until recently the wave of immigration from Mexico and Central America and elsewhere, where you come into this country with few skills, so you're starting, which skews income numbers. When you're 20, you learn, general rule, you earn less than when you're 40 or 50. And so that probably skewed the picture, even though those who had come started to move up. You had newcomers coming in that seemed to keep the average low. So that all is changing. And I think something like this, it's going to get around, especially in the word viral. You're going to see it become pretty quick.
Do you think it will reach these boards? Do you think they'll reach the boards of directors?
The nice thing about free markets is, if you see if you're told there's an opportunity, somebody's going to figure it out. And if an existing board is not going to figure it out, an outlier entrepreneur is going to figure it out. As you know, research shows often the biggest disruptors are those outside of an industry breaking in than those who think they already know. So my father liked to say, if you think you've arrived in business, you're ready to be shown the door. Things don't stay the same. So I don't worry about boards. If they don't get it, new boards are coming. And one of the things that Kaufman studies have found, in which I hope we can regenerate, is one of the great dynamisms of the American economy, different from us and even from much of Asia, is that every generation we create in this country 50 to 75 new big companies. Obviously they start small, but they become the giants of tomorrow. And you look at Google and others, they didn't exist 20 years ago. Now our FANGs are taking over the world. They're doing this, that, and the other. That's a sign of success in this country when you get to be a big company and people fear you're taking over the world. But that is an advantage that we have, and so I don't worry about existing boards. The new ones will come along and replace them if they don't wake up to the opportunity.
So I thank you very much for those remarks. I'm going to pause here so that I can direct now opportunity for questions from the audience. I've been asking all the questions, and I think there is a mic for some of the hands being raised.
Thank you. One of the measures that we're talking about is GDP growth. But what about GDP per capita, a measure of standard of living? What are you seeing there?
I mean, basically what you're seeing there is that a gradual convergence. What you saw, and the best metric for that, because you don't really have GDP per capita by community, but what you have are wage data. So what you can see is there is that the percentage of Latino average wages as a share of the U.S. average began to decline in the 1980s and 1990s as you started to have a large inflow of unskilled migrants. But that stopped in the mid-1990s at a level of about 70% of the U.S. average. And that is now up to, again, it has basically been growing slowly since then. That is now up to about 77%, which is entirely consistent with a rising average level of educational attainment in the community. So basically, lots of progress has been made, but that progress, you know, there's still significant road ahead, but the catch-up actually has been accelerating. And as I said, I think that is a direct function of rising educational attainment and entrepreneurship as well, of course.
Another question here in the middle.
I got one.
Oh, great.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Victor Arias. I chair the Latino Business Action Network that really puts together the initiative at Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative. And we are there to really help Latino businesses scale. We do a lot of research on the ecosystem, and we help develop the ecosystem there. Just some facts about Latino entrepreneurs. 40% of them are millennials, and 36% are immigrants. And of those immigrants, the vast majority, 86% of those, are DACA-type individuals. And I'm not sure that the president has done any favors on that regard. And so, and despite all that, I mean, the Latino businesses have grown since 2007 by 46%, while non-Latino businesses have declined by 4%. So as you were saying, yeah, the cavalry has come. But I would like to get your comments on the kinds of rhetoric that the president allows around Latinos.
Well, in terms of the whole immigration debate, I thought the White House missed a huge opportunity in this fight about the wall, whether it should be $1 billion or $5 billion or whatever, of doing something of upending the Democrats, and that is taking the DACA, the Dreamers, and saying not 3 years, but saying totally legal. They were not responsible, totally legal. Just do it. You do that, and if you'd combine that with H-1B visa reform, which is in Nancy Pelosi's neighborhood, i.e. the Valley, Silicon Valley, you would have had an irresistible package that would have done it. Ultimately, I think the Dreamers are, first of all, no one is going to be putting boxcars and that's just not going to happen. So the question is, how quickly are we? I think the Dreamers will come first, totally legalized, citizenship, all that. The other 10 million or so, undocumented, I think what you'll see as the first step is they will have legal status. They don't have to worry anymore about deportation or anything. They're here to stay. That'll be combined with, and then in 10 years they'll do something else, you know, vote or whatever, but you have to do these things in steps. So Dreamers first, and then the other 10 million, and but they won't be full citizenship initially, but they will have total legal status. They don't have to. They can go back and forth, no problem. And that I think, and then but key, which has not gotten much attention, is we must reform the system. It is so inefficient, so arbitrary and capricious, and sometimes easy, sometimes infuriatingly slow. They got to make it so very efficient. You get vetted, you're in, you're not in. And when they do reform, there'll be this emphasis on more skilled-based immigration, fine. But they must also have provisions for people who have the ambition, but not yet the wealth. The ambition, but not yet the degree. My grandfather was one of 10 children, immigrant to this country from Scotland. One of 10 children, grade school education. He probably wouldn't meet some of the proposed requirements today. And I'd rather be here than Scotland, thank you very much. But the reform will come. Most Americans are ready for it. They're sick and tired of this thing dragging on. And eventually both parties, at least most of both parties, will recognize the politics you think you milk from this issue is long past. It's now counterproductive. Get the thing done. But again, it'll start with the dreamers, 1.5, 1.8 million. Then the logical one is the 10 million, 11 million, pick a number. And a lot of those people who are here today would be quite happy to go back and forth if they knew that it was safe to do so. Right now, if you get here and you are not documented, you dare not go back for fear that you're not going to be able to get back in again. So the free flow, and that gets to another thing, and that is we do need H-1B visa-like programs for other parts of the economy where there's a need for people, instead of averting the eyes as we did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, have real programs where you come, we know who you are, and that way it just is much more fair and efficient system, and also doesn't block you from moving ahead. If you're here, not here, if you're not here legally, you have to be very careful looking over your shoulder. You don't want to get too prominent, which puts a cap on how far you can rise. Not good for them or for us.
Thank you. One last question. I don't know. Looking at you, Sol.
I have a comment at the end. But
all right, so go ahead, sir.
My name is Javier Martinez, and I am represent an organization here in Los Angeles, Association of Mexican Entrepreneurs, and this is relevant for my question. You know, the standard version, which you have been refuted partially here, is that low income in our community is correlated to low level of educational attainment, and in turn, that is correlated to entrepreneurship, because to become an entrepreneur, the barrier is low. And it's probably true, I don't know how much it's true, but you know, it's low, the barrier to entry for an entrepreneur. However, it doesn't mean that no skills are required. So the question for you is, what kind of skills you think are needed to become an entrepreneur? Number one. And second, any idea as to how can we get our community to acquire those skills? Thank you.
Well, I think in terms of, for an entrepreneur, requirement number one is what my grandfather called stick-to-itiveness and learning. It's amazing how many entrepreneurs said, if I had any idea what I was getting into, you know, I might not have been so eager. You learn as you go. But in terms of getting skills, you have everything from community colleges, where if you think you need a course on something, online there's a lot of software out there that can help you out. But this also gets to the opportunity, especially with higher ed. You can get education online, and this is where Purdue University is a leader by buying Kaplan, recognizing that adult education is a huge booming market. You may not get a formal degree, but you can take courses or certificates of study that are relevant to where you think you need to ramp up your particular skills, whether you're starting a business or you want to improve your prospects with an existing company. You're going to see much more of that. So this idea that if you don't have a 4-year degree, you're not going to, your chances of success are less, I think is going to become less relevant, especially when you have today 7 million job openings in this country and 6 million unemployed. There are a lot of jobs going begging, but people don't have the skills to take them. I think that's going to change. So the key thing is the desire. And entrepreneurship's not for everyone. You have to recognize that. It's, and sometimes it's environment induced, as you point out. There's opportunity entrepreneurship and do it or die entrepreneurship. My business, the whole print business, was upended by the internet. We've made the adjustment. I'll pat myself on the back since our competitors won't. I think we did the adjustment better than anyone else. But we do live in an era where you, as the saying goes, you eat well or sleep well, but not both. The eating part I do, the sleep part is another matter.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Okay, let me just make 3 comments very quickly in addition to thanking. Number one, I'd just like to remind everybody that the foundation of our country was not based on a 2-class system. That's why we actually had a revolution. And as an American with a value set that believes in the founding fathers, I think as we think about immigration, we should always think about a quick migration where anybody that wants to be a citizen can be a citizen. But we need to solve the problem quickly. That's comment number one. Comment number two is just what you said, Steve, which is the idea that we spend our time arguing about a wall or no wall is silly because it doesn't fix anything. And we do have a broken process, which big companies that are making transformations, all that sort of thing, we do all the time. We fix the systems. We know how to solve it IT-wise, process-wise, etc. And so, you know, my encouragement to you would be, the more you say that publicly, you personally, because of your stature, and having a publication and reminding people, let's fix the problem, which is this backlog and how we process and how we keep track and all that. That will really, I think, start helping shape people's thinking about what we should spend our time on, besides what I would call the political stuff, because we do need to fix it. And the last thing that I would just say to you is that although we live in a digital era, the imprimatur that you give when you write the kind of article that came in Forbes, it has a lot of impact and weight. And the reason why is because publications like yours, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, whatever, you have an editorial process, you validate data, all that sort of thing. Some of the stuff out there in social media, you know, you don't know whether it's true or not and what the sources are or not, whether there's any sources other than opinions. So when a publication like yours writes the article that you did, which was the basis for this conversation, it really means a lot. And so...
Well, thank you, but this also gets to the importance of what Jacob and his institution have done, is doing the scut work, laborious, unglamorous research that you can quickly abstract that gets the word out there. So without him, the rest of us would, you know, be drinking lattes, you know.
Well, and that was going to be part B of it, which is we are very focused at the Latino Donor Collaborative on facts and data, research, studies, etc. And as Jeff Eisenach, who's sitting here, he did a study 2 years ago that basically showed that 29% of all real income growth, this is 2 years ago, the period of 2005 to 2015, 29% of all real income growth in the U.S. was tied to this cohort. Okay, that's pre-tax cuts, pre-anything. And so this cohort has been dynamic, is dynamic, and will continue to be, just as you said. So let me first thank Ted and all his colleagues and Jacob and obviously you, Steve, for being here, because this really is important, this conversation, for our country, for the Latino community, and for everybody to really understand. So thank all of you. Thank you.